Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Judy Chan, Deputy Director of Digital Services at C2C. Thank you for being here today. This is the third meeting of the Cradle-to-Career Workforce Data Expansion Task Force.
Recording in progress.
We are delighted. Sorry about that. We're delighted to have you join us and continue to share your expertise with us. Today's agenda, next slide, will include I'm going to walk us through today's agenda. And today's agenda includes a recap of the second task force meeting we had in February. After that, we will clarify the process for adding new data. We'll review a summary of the requested data points from LWDA, as well as from this task force. We will then ask the group to do an activity on prioritization, and then we will also gather input about how C2C can provide information to improve labor market information. As the meeting notes materials can be found on, as a note, the meeting materials can be found on the C2C task force page. But first, I will review the process for general public comment. Next slide, please. So throughout the meeting, task force members can have access to chat. You'll be able to comment verbally or via chat. For members of the public, you can use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen to pose questions. You may also submit public comment to info@c2c.ca.gov. We encourage you to submit your questions, but please note that our team may not be able to get to all of your questions. Please go ahead and submit your questions anyway, because your questions can help inform the content of the conversation for future meetings. At this time, I'd like to introduce our facilitator, Kathy Booth from West Ed, to take us through today's meeting. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you, Judy. All right. So it may feel like a while ago, but we did have a very productive meeting last month. I thought it'd be helpful to just sort of remind us all what we talked about. Again, all this information is available if you follow that link that was put, I believe, into chat and is up on the screen. What we do is we keep a document that is the ongoing notes from all the meetings. You can find it all in one place easily. So in our last meeting, we were really making sure that the task force members had a strong understanding of the types of data that the labor agency was intending to contribute to the Cradle-to-Career P20W analytical data set. And also just to make sure that you were clear about what are the parameters for that existing data that C2C manages. So we spent a chunk of time having Judy Chan answering questions about how the C2C data system works, and Abby Snay from the labor agency really talking through the specifics of the type of data that's available through the labor agency and choices that were made about which data points to contribute to the C2C data set. Then what we did is we wanted to give an opportunity for our task force members to really think through all the ways that the information that would be generated when we bring together the labor market data, the labor agency data, and all the information, the more than 200 data points that are already in the C2C data set. What is it that we could do with that information? And this was important because in the original memo from the labor agency, they laid out a whole bunch of research questions that they had that they felt could be answered if the data were brought together. But we wanted to make sure that the data would also be useful for other entities like the task force members that represent a wide range of perspectives, whether it's people who work with workforce entities or researchers or other agencies that might benefit from that information. So in that document that summarizes, you'll see the full list of the types of research questions and visualizations that the group came up with, but I thought I'd sort of highlight some of the themes. So the first is that there was definitely an interest in generating additional data points about cross-agency outcomes. So one of the examples that you all came up with that could be created with this expanded data set would be to look at the proportions of students who took a career technical education course in high school that subsequently were part of a workforce training program offered by the labor agency, and then to understand what their employment outcomes would be with the ability to disaggregate that information by a host of different factors like student demographics or the industry of occupation or where that student was actually located. So that was like one example of that what would be possible. The other issue that you all flagged was more opportunities to do program comparisons, again, going above and beyond what the labor agency had flagged. So a good example of that from the task force recommendations would be differences in employment outcomes when learners also receive public benefits, and then disaggregating that information based on the demographics of the the traditional education and also workforce training programs. So to really understand, do public benefits make a bigger difference when you are enrolled in like traditional post-secondary or when you're doing maybe more short-term training associated with the labor agency. And then you also identified a number of additional employment outcomes that could be generated. So an example here is to really go long term to understand when people complete a specific education or a training program, what happens to them over much longer time horizons, including things like do they get jobs? Do they stay in jobs? How much do their earnings increase? And whether they end up receiving public benefits. And then you could see how that would be changing over time as they do subsequent training. So maybe somebody did short-term training that got them to employment, but not to a strong living wage. When you stack on that, maybe a community college credential, you could see how much that would shift. And all this again could be disaggregated by demographics, industry, and location. So really, you all came up with a bunch of really exciting ideas for additional research that could be conducted. The next thing that we did is we said, okay, so that's great. We could have all those different data points, but what would actually change in the world? And so the focus became on who would the users be and what would they do with this information? So one of the things that you identified is that policymakers and state agencies could use the information for funding and policy decisions to support the creation of stronger pathways, better wages, and reducing equity gaps. You identified that researchers could use the information to figure out industries that need to improve worker outcomes and get information that could result in better program design, whether that's on the education or the workforce training side of the house. You thought that education and training providers could use the information to better understand what's happening in the workforce, to understand loss points in the pipeline, to designate targeted training and upskilling programs that are more responsive so that we could build stronger pathways, that you could use it to support recruitment into education and training programs, for individual advising, for strengthening outcomes, and to fulfill accountability reporting. On the side of employers, you identified that they could use the information to better understand the available talent pool, workforce trends, and really good quality training opportunities that they could recommend their employees to. For union members, advocates in the community, you noted that they could use the information to push for fair pay structures and better education and training options, and that individuals themselves could use the information to inform their education and career choices. So this is a really good validation that the types of information that are getting prioritized for a state data asset like Cradle-to-Career are going to have a variety of applications that are really going to be leveling the playing field for access to data for a huge range of users. So this was very affirming related to what the labor agency was suggesting. So all of this has been focusing on the data that the labor agency has already agreed that it wants to share. The other thing that happened in that memo originally from the labor agency was they identified even more information that they would like other entities to provide. And then you all also identified a host of additional data sources. And this is a very natural thing. And I will speak as a researcher. If I can get more data, I'm going to try to get it. But we have to be realistic about how much information is going into the Cradle-to-Career data system. And to do so, we thought that we'd have Marianne Bates, the executive director for Cradle-to-Career, explain a little bit more about what it means to be expanding the data set and what processes would need to be followed. So Marianne, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Kathy, and it's great to see all of you today. In a moment, I'll talk through what our process is, what mechanisms exist already for bringing new data or even new data partners into our collaborative work. And as I talk through that, I'd love to ask you to think about prioritization and trade-offs. So Kathy alluded to this. We're now at a stage where we have a very long wish list, a long wish list that LWDA brought in, a longer wish list now that you've looked at it. But your impact as a task force will be greater if you communicate very clear priorities as well. So not just here's the long wish list, but if we could just have a few, right? If you could just have a handful of additional kinds of data that's linked at the individual level in our data system, what small handful would you prioritize above the rest? And the reason I say that is that, we really have to think carefully given our capacity as a team and the resources we have available. So you might think about this in a couple of ways. I often think about it as like, bang for buck, right? Which data points have the best combination of both being feasible or being reliably collected and impact. And how do you think about impact? One way that I think about that is, would bringing this new information in change decision making? Would bringing this new information in help us see something that we can't see today or that we can't see easily today? So that's a long-winded way of saying, as I talk through what the process is, I would love for you to get into that uncomfortable space of prioritizing one thing above another, of being realistic about constraints, and step for a moment outside of the like, let's make the longest wish list of everything we could possibly want and overlay that with, yes, we want all of that, but if we could just have a few things, here are the pieces we would most want. So if you can join us in that space today, I think it will really provide more clarity to the recommendations coming from this task force and help them be more impactful. Okay, with that preamble, let's go to the next slide and I'll talk about the process that is used with the data system. So this looks different based on whether the entity that collects this data at the state level is already a data provider to C2C or not. So this slide looks at the process for collecting new data points or bringing in new data points from entities who are already data providers to Cradle-to-Career. They've already signed our legal agreements. They're already a part of this. So the first step is to identify research questions and associated data points. That's exactly what you're doing in this task force. It's starting with the why, right? What questions could be answered? Which ones are the most high priority ones? And then which data points are already collected by some entity or could feasibly be collected that could answer those questions. Then our governing board takes action to add new data points. And as a refresher, we have a 21-person governing board. It's defined in statute. It's about half composed of data providers and half composed of appointees who represent the public. So one benefit of all of this is we have a clear structure about who gets to make decisions about Cradle-to-Career, and it's the governing board. So they take formal action by 2/3 majority vote to add new data points to the list of P20W data points, and then requests those data from our data providers. And then our office needs to create the actual infrastructure to receive those new data points from the data provider integrated into the data system through defining very specific file specifications and then doing that import and linkage. So that's the process for existing data providers. If we can go to the next slide. If there is a state entity who is not yet a signatory of Cradle-to-Career's legal agreements, this looks slightly different. So the first step is still the same, identifying important research questions and what would the associated data points be in collaboration with that potential data provider. And then an additional step would happen for the governing board to take action to add that entity as a data provider to Cradle-to-Career, and that new data provider then signs the participation agreement. And we have a pair of legal agreements that each entity signs, and that provides the foundation for enabling them to share data with the data system. And then, like in the previous slide, the governing board then also takes action to add specific individual data points to the list of P20W data points, and then requests those formally from the data provider. And then again, we develop the infrastructure and do the file specs. So this looks different across the things on the wish list that you'll discuss today. So for example, Labor and Workforce Development Agency is already a signatory to the legal agreements. Some of their departments, but not all, are already signatories. And each department and agency determines to what extent the agency signature suffices or if individual departments under an agency also sign, and we work through that on a case-by-case basis. Next slide, please. One benefit of our large governance structure is that it provides a way for there to be clarity about decision making around what work are we prioritizing, what policy areas and related data points are we focusing on. It allows for that to be flexible over time. So there were some clear priorities set out in our statute when we began, and the statute creates with the governing board a mechanism for the annual priorities of the data system and what we're focusing on to be determined. And that's done through board action. As I mentioned, the board takes votes. And our office can inform and provide information to the governing board by doing outreach and exploratory analysis to determine the feasibility of additional data sources. And that can help inform how the governing board gives us direction and tells us what aspects to prioritize. So for example, we last summer, when they approved our work plan for the year, we had conversations about prioritizing an expansion and looking at workforce data. So this is planned for work that our governing board directed us to take and was part of the original 5-year timeline that we've updated over time. And as we do that, as we do that exploratory analysis to determine the feasibility of the data, we look at different factors. The ones I really want to elevate for you to think about today have to do with the way the data are collected and validated, so data quality issues, any new costs that may be incurred if data needs to be shared or collected in new ways, and just the staff capacity of our office, which has 26 staff total, counting all operational staff and the staff who run our board meetings, et cetera. So for example, when you think about potential data, it may be worth thinking about whether that data is collected as administrative data consistently for everyone, or whether it's collected through self-reported information or surveys, maybe only for a small subset of people who are in a program, as opposed to for all Californians or for all who are participating in something. So as you think about what data to prioritize, I'd recommend thinking carefully about how that data is originally collected, by which entity, and whether it's kind of collected in a very universal and consistent way, or if it's collected in a perhaps more self-reported or only for a subset of people. So with limited resources, I also want to highlight that this process means that if we're talking about a major expansion of work for the office, it may need to be paired with a plan to bring in new kinds of data, also requesting more resources so that we have the right capacity to be able to do the work. I think that's all I'll highlight on this, though happy to answer questions later on if that's helpful. If we can go to the next slide, please. So as you think about potential new data points for the Cradle-to-Career data system, perhaps some ways to think through the scope of that and how to face these trade-offs is to really first and foremost think about the needs of Californians, right? What kinds of data can we bring together that would enable people to make more informed decisions from a policy standpoint or operational that can really serve the needs of Californians? Looking at impact and alignment with the Cradle-to-Career mission helps. And then this third part about reliable information is what I referred to a moment ago in the prior slide. So thinking about how are these data points collected? Are they collected in a consistent way already by another entity that brings them together at the state level? That's really the sweet spot for how Cradle-to-Career has been designed and envisioned. So with that in mind, I guess my closing thought here is how I opened, which is that today is really an opportunity for you to communicate priorities in the face of trade-offs. So my final, encouragement here is let's get out of the space of, wishful, broad hopes and think about, what are the realities? How is data collected today? What are the trade-offs? And given all of that, what would you most like to prioritize? What do you think will be most important amongst your long wish list? And that's not an easy thing to do. So I'm really grateful that you're here and helping us do that hard work. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Kathy.
So I want to make sure that we've got time for questions from the task force and also to take a moment to look at our Q&A from the field. So I'm just curious, does anyone on the task force have a question or an observation for Marianne?
Maybe I have a clarification question. Oh, the one thing I thought was missing from your high-level summary was potential barriers to program access and success. So it feels like if we want to figure out which training and education programs work best, we also need to know how, what is the situation of the people taking it. And it's implicit because you have programs in there, right? But there are barriers to success and access strikes me as an important bucket to figure out the right programming. Um, just to put that out there.
Thank you for highlighting that. Thank you for elevating that. I think what I'm hearing you say is that we should pay attention not only to who is actively accessing programs today, but who could be, but isn't. Is that what you did?
Well, and also there's a lot of research showing that training participants in training programs have only mixed successes afterwards. And I think it's partly because we're not properly accounting for the situations they're in and not properly complementing these programs to address these situations.
Yeah.
And so that here's a sort of a chance to get the information to understand why we sometimes see these very low returns or these unsatisfactory outcomes, right? And how to better support workers taking these programs.
Thank you for highlighting that. I think that also points to some really interesting questions around how we can look for data sources that can capture both people who are receiving the services and people who haven't, so you can have that comprehensive picture. Thank you.
And I'm in particular thinking of criminal justice records that will matter for a big chunk of the lower wage population.
Lisa.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm wondering if we have, as we're thinking about reliability and coverage with the different metrics, I'm wondering if we have information that maybe I missed on which of the metrics that LWDA can provide are captured across a broad scope of individuals. And I'm thinking about, I mean, obviously we all want like all the data, right? And I'm not trying to pick on a metric, but I'm thinking about the internship metric. Like we've talked about getting data on internships for years, and those data are always incomplete. So as we're thinking about prioritizing, do we have, along with our list, some assessment by LWDA or some other entity of scope of data, reliability, the probability that the data will be collected into the future, and those kinds of questions?
Thank you for highlighting that.
I could go next. That's okay. Uh, just
Absolutely.
and on that front, just data matching and understanding that many of our agencies across the whole state you might have their own silos of data, and so if we could work across all at least state agencies to do better, matching data because the data might exist but not be matched to an individual or populations that could work across all the different departments. So, instead of trying to come up with new questions, figure out what gaps are there after we do better matching of data.
Thank you.
I think it's worth noting that to speak to Till's earlier question, that when we have these comprehensive records, so basically if someone has touched a public agency, odds are their data is going to be in C2C. So that way you could do some interesting matched comparisons where you could say, here's somebody who's very, very similar, but never showed up at the labor agency related programs, and begin to triangulate some of those conditions that might help us understand what's missing when we're looking just in silos. And that one of the powers of the way that C2C C2C is structured is that because we're not relying on a single matching number, there's a lot in the beginning of the planning process, there was a lot of discussion about using the unique K-12 identifier as a way to link all the records. But of course, that's not going to work if you've got somebody like me who didn't go to K-12 in California, but maybe I have a record somewhere else. So we have more opportunities for the model that C2C has adopted to be able to find the universe of Californians and then figure out where they're touching these different public agencies that gather data on them. I also want to go back. My apologies. For some reason, I couldn't get to my unmute button earlier. Lisa, you sort of asked a question about sort of the reliability and comprehensiveness of the data. I don't know, Abby, if there was anything that you wanted to share related to that, especially related to the process that the different data divisions within the labor agency will go through before they submit their data.
I mean, just to say that that's exactly what we're going to be working on when we really get into data specifications, and we have all the data points from all of the departments for all the participants that we want. So that goes back to why participating in C2C and in this data expansion is so aligned with LWDA's effort to data collection and reporting and analysis.
Are there other questions from task force members? And then I'll quickly go to, we've got a little bit of Q&A coming from the public for people looking for contextual information. So one person had asked about what resource constraints C2C is running into in terms of gathering data and usage. I didn't know if the C2C team wanted to address this directly related to your role in data gathering.
Sure, I'm happy to. The vision for Cradle-to-Career is that we bring together data that is already being collected and validated at the state level. So we don't directly collect data from individuals. We don't even directly collect data, for example, from individual schools or colleges, right? We work with these state level entities. So for example, the California Community College's Chancellor's Office, as opposed to each individual community college. And we work with the California Department of Education as opposed to individual schools. And we work with those entities who are already collecting the data at a statewide level. And then we do the work of stitching it together so that we can have a longitudinal picture and across lots of different components of someone's experience and bring the data together. So it's not about going out and collecting new data. I see one of the other questions is also around kind of using social media for sentiment analysis and decision making and things like that. We're not going out and collecting new data directly. It's rather about linking data that's already been collected at the state level. And once we have our research data request process open and available, it could be possible for a researcher to imagine a study where they use de-identified data from the data system and combine that with other kinds of research or other kinds of information outside the data system. But the data system itself, think of it as being an entity to bring together data that is already being collected at the state level for the whole state.
Great. Thank you so much, Marianne. All right. One of the reasons that we wanted to pause for a moment and think about prioritization is because our next activity is that we're going to ask the task force members to pick the 3 types of data that would be new data that's been requested either by you or by the labor agency that you think should be pursued by C2C. So I'm going to share my screen again. Hopefully this time it'll go a little smoother. See, are you seeing the slideshow now? Can you see the slideshow up on the screen? Yes, good. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go through all of the things that you all came up with. So starting from LWDA, they were hoping that the community colleges would, in addition to the data they're already providing, put in course records, the non-credit status of courses, the incarceration status of students, and all the data points that they currently provide for the CalSkills database that's built by the labor agency. From the California Department of Education, the request was for data points that are provided also for CalSkills related to K-12 adult schools. From the Health and Human Services Agency, they were hoping for information on participation in workforce training programs that are offered by HHS as opposed to programs that are provided by the labor agency. From the Department of Corrections, and this goes back to Till's comment, they're looking for a number of data points related to involvement in the justice system, ranging from the charge status, their incarceration status, whether they got some sort of education or credential while they were incarcerated, when they were released, where they were released to, whether they have post-release rehab, the recidivism status, the recidivism rate, and the language that they speak. Also, LWDA thought it would be helpful to have information from the Franchise Tax Board about earnings and the zip code where people live. From the US Census, they were hoping for earnings data. From California Volunteers, they were hoping for information on participation in service earning. They're looking to expand the data collected directly from employers to be able to have information on the number of hours that employees work, where they're employed, the actual location of employment, and their occupation. And then to that list, this group added a number of additional data points from the Health and Human Service Agency, including whether people are receiving housing subsidies, their in-home supportive services, their family status, their participation in childcare programs, measures of health and behavioral health data. You also hoped that from the Department of Consumer Affairs, we could collect licensure data. That would be things like a contracting license or a licensed vocational nurse. From the Department of Motor Vehicles, information on car ownership, whether someone has a driver's license and if they have a disability placard. And then from unions, information on their membership, success stories, and the priorities of the business community. So we all are so hungry. There's so much data that would be really useful for decision making. So what we're going to do is we're going to, oh, I'm sorry, I missed some. You are hoping for information from the Social Security Administration on supplemental security income and disability insurance, from the IRS on fringe benefits, and from the US Census on immigration status, date of arrival to the US, and country of origin. So Cesar, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, just Department of Apprenticeship Standards and kind of, a certification, because every apprentice in California has the follow through on the certification process through Department of Apprenticeship Standards. So success stories there.
So the DAS data about apprenticeship is slotted for inclusion in the data system. So that was both flagged originally and is part of the set of data points that LWDA has offered to provide.
Oh, great! I didn't see it on the list. That's why.
This is all the stuff that you asked for that is not currently going to be provided. So right now we're just focusing on the and yet more portion of our desire for more data. Till, go ahead. Oops, you're on mute.
Thank you. Just a comment on the FTB data, because it's such a high-hanging fruit potentially to get, but it's also very valuable because it has information on 1099s, meaning if somebody is an independent contractor, you'll have those earnings which you don't have in the current earnings. And for some, that may play an important role and an increasing role. So that would be very valuable. And they all have family status from the 1040s, and there's information on occupation. So there's a whole range of valuable points from the FTB. I just mentioned that because there's a real cost benefit trade-off here.
So you'll note that already lobbying has begun for your voting about which data sources to focus on. So it's very helpful to clarify why that might be something that you all would prioritize. Any other comments or questions before we get to our voting section?
I had a question. This is Renee from the Chamber, Chino Valley Chamber of Commerce. We do a lot of justice impacted work, really allowing our businesses to become second chance employers. But just its confidentiality is a huge issue in our end. So I just wanted to know how that you will be addressing that as well.
You mean the confidentiality of data once it goes into the Cradle-to-Career data system?
Yes, or even before while collecting the data.
Does anyone from C2C want to address that, or do you want me to?
I can do it. So C2C adheres to all federal and state standards. Data privacy and confidentiality is very important to us. And so we also, in terms of securing the data, that we have a security task force, a securities policy task force, where data providers that provide data to CTC have a seat on to ensure that the data that comes into the data system are secured in transition, in as it comes into the data system, as well as when it's stored in the data system.
If I can just add to what Judy mentioned as well, our data tools display information only for groups of people, never for individuals. So when we put out a dashboard visual, it won't show data even for, say there's just 5 people. If you were zooming in on a particular question or disaggregating by geography or characteristics, the visuals are coded in such a way that it masks that information. And that was all developed during the planning process. So there are very careful processes in place around ensuring that the data that's used to link people in the data system and be able to create that picture is kept entirely separate from the information that's used to create the data tools. Thank you for that question. It's an incredibly important aspect of our work.
Lisa.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that the U.S. Census variable on immigration status does not have any information on whether a person is documented or not. It is a much broader question.
Thanks for that clarification. Annalise.
Yeah, I was wondering about the license or state issued ID data point. How does that fit in, or does it at all fit in with like the ways you might verify identity? I know like in Colorado, they're using driver's licenses as a digital wallet to then later connect learning and employment information. And state issued IDs are important. For example, like if you're re-entering after prison, you know, the sooner you can get access to that, the easier it is to unlock a lot of other things. So I'm just curious, like, how does this fit in with your broader, like, identity verification strategy?
Marianne, do you want to speak to that?
I was just looking to see if anyone else was going to jump in. So I think what I heard you ask is how we use identifying information within the data system. So the first answer to that question is, as Kathy had highlighted, the kinds of identifying information that our different data providers have differs. So for example, the identifying information from a K-12 record will look different from the identifying information from higher education. Driver's license data in particular, the part of the relevance there is that they're privacy protecting ways to enhance the linkages across different entities that may not all use the same identifiers to essentially fill in the gaps without violating privacy or bringing in new information. So that's kind of a broad answer to that question. I know a number of different states are exploring options related to that.
Okay, so I was just trying to make the point that I think there could be a use case beyond just having the driver's license information. Because of that, I think it's worth thinking about. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So
Actually,
now is,
uh,
go
I'm
ahead,
so
Tom.
sorry. I have a rather technical clarification question because I'm the director of the Census Data Research Center here at UCLA. So I deal with merges with census data all the time. Are you thinking that the Census Bureau would send you data to add to C2C? Or are you thinking that the C2C will be brought into a Census Research Data Center? I'm just thinking there's sort of some important details here because usually Census doesn't send PII to outside entities.
I
So I
want
was
to
just
clarify,
curious.
this list was generated by task force members, not by C2C. So I believe that there was someone on the task force who hoped that there would be access to federal census data.
It
But you
actually,
make a good
census
point.
was actually in the list that came from LWDA originally.
Oh, it did. Thank you,
Yeah,
Lisa.
earnings from census, yes.
And we're happy to provide more information of how that would work.
Yeah. Just responding to what Till said, I think that level of specificity is incredibly helpful. and having some curiosity around, I'm not aware of mechanisms for identified data to leave census either, which would limit the ability to bring it into the data system at an individual level.
Okay, I want to make sure that there's time for everybody to get their votes in. So what we're going to do is we're going to put up a poll on the screen that just the task force members will have access to. And what you'll get to do is you get to pick 3, please only pick 3, of all these different types of data that would allow us to prioritize. So I think it's in the chat that you all can see that you'll see a link to Mentimeter. I'm going to stop my share, and my colleague, Rocio is going to share her screen so that we can see live as you vote. So
I will
again,
give folks a minute, and then I will display my screen for all to see the results. So, another 30 seconds. Thank you.
okay, has everyone had a chance to vote for their 3? Anyone need another minute? Okay, I'm gonna assume that we're good to go. So here on the screen, you can see visually, of course, you have to have really good eyesight because it looks fairly small on my screen, at least, so I'll lean in to read. So our top choice here, I don't know if we can make that bigger, unfortunately, but I will try to read it aloud so that people can like have some voiceover for the visualization. So the most popular choice with 9 votes is to expand the information that's collected from employers for the base wage file. So this is the idea that we would ask employers to provide information about how many hours an employee worked, where they are physically working, and what their actual occupation is, their job title or the job category. So that was the most popular. Our next most popular with 7 votes is to add the franchise tax board as a data provider. Of course, we did have a rationale for why this would be so valuable, but there's a clear theme with these 2 of really wanting to expand upon the information that we have about employment. Our third biggest vote getter with 5 votes is adding the Department of Corrections as a data provider. I think that that's like both consistent with comments from this group, but also was a major area of focus for the labor agency and that issue of if people are incarcerated, it's much more difficult for them both to work and then get jobs later. So let's see. After that, we've got a fair number of ties with 3 votes. So we have expand the California Department of Education data to include K-12 adult school information. We also have add the Department of Motor Vehicles, which is what we talked about. They would improve the match rates, but also give us more information about people's ability to drive, which is actually the most common license that an employer asks for. And our next is to figure out ways to get data from the US Census. And then, of course, we had votes for many of the other ones. So this is really helpful because what it's doing is it's pointing us to the idea that what you're most focused on is getting to stronger employment information and filling in some of those gaps related to both corrections and adult education as things that we currently can't see right now in the data system. All right, so now that I've done a little bit of interpreting, I'm actually going to have Rocio and her share, and I will share my screen again. Because what we're going to do is we're going to give you a chance to explain why. So this is the thing that is different between a longitudinal data system where you have only numbers and being able to deal with the people that are providing the information. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to send you to a Google document where we're going to ask you to go to the 3 items that you selected and give us some more information about it. So, and if you decide you've changed your mind and you want to give information on a different data point, that's fine. But what's important for us to capture from you is, so let's say it was the Department of Corrections that you chose. Why do you think this is the top priority to include? Who would use the information and how would they use it? And this gives us a way to be able to provide more information to the board, the governing board, about why it would be useful to have this additional item in the work plan for future years. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen. Please go to the chat, and that's where you will find the link to this Google Doc, and I will share the Google Doc while you're putting information in. We're going to give you a good 10 minutes so that you really have a chance to write thoughtfully. So we're going to, for people from the public, things will be quiet for the next 10 minutes while the task force members type, but I will try to scroll up and down the screen so you can get a sense for the things that they are sharing. Any questions or concerns about accessing the Google Doc? All right. Enjoy your time writing. We've got about 2 more minutes to keep putting your thoughts in. Okay, we're at 10 minutes. So I realize there's a lot of things to share, and so we'll leave this Google Doc open for members of the task force to continue to provide your thoughts about why you're prioritizing particular data sources. And that can help inform a write-up that we'll do that will be then presented to this Cradle-to-Career Governing Board. So what I want to do is take a few minutes and have you just maybe voice over, especially because for members of the public that are watching, it's going to be difficult to read what was on the screen. Do people want to share why it was that they prioritized what they did? And let's see if I can do this from memory. So I think our first, the biggest vote getter was for expanding the data collection from employers. So does anyone want to unmute and just share your thoughts about why that's so important and how it could be used? Parents.
Hi. I think this, in terms of, clustering together the different types of data, this was in the wage data cluster, if you will. There's about 3 or 4 items that were different ways of getting at employment, wage data, things like that. And I think that is a piece of, I'm assuming a lot of us identified that in various components because it's been very difficult to get at. We've had to either do individual agreements between an agency and EDD or do surveys or some mix thereof. It's been a little frustrating and challenging to have that consistent information. And it's so crucial for so many programs. There's so much funding that goes into workforce development and the expectation, both the moral and legal imperative to ensure that there's equity in employment rates and in wages. And to really measure the effectiveness of those inputs, you have to have a really consistent data source. So that's where I was all over the place. And so, like I said, well, if we can get Social Security or IRS, that's great. If it's only franchise tax board, then let's go for that. So at least that's where I was coming from with really focusing on the wage data to support, like the K-16 collaborative initiatives, centers for excellence, any training provider, people seeking grants, reporting to the feds, reporting to the state or private funders. So that was my thinking where I was coming from by emphasizing various sources like that. And then, of course, directly from employers is one place to get that from, in addition to some of these other agencies.
Great. Alex?
Agree with everything that Terrence has shared so far. I wanted to say as well, this was obviously one of my votes too. I think from a regional perspective, a lot of folks, they are having these workforce training programs or colleges, et cetera, as a grow your own methodology for their overall workforce development. And so it's really important for folks to understand the people that I'm training, are they actually staying in my region? Are they, the people that I'm training, is my community getting the benefit from that? So I was really excited to see in that as one of the data points, the location of employment as well, because a lot of people I think would be interested in seeing once people do complete their training programs, do they stay in their regions? Do they stay in their communities or do they leave? Where do they go, et cetera? I think that'd be a really key point a lot of people would want answers to. And then just as what Terrence was saying too, for so many training programs, colleges, this idea of where their learners go after they've completed their programs can often be a black box that they don't really know the impact. And that's one of the biggest outcomes that we want to be able to provide our learners is, that they actually get a good, successful job after they're done with their training. So this would be phenomenal to be able to expand and agree, whether that's through the tax board or through the base wage file. I think this is just so critical.
Till.
I'm going to piggyback on that and say that there's sort of two elements here that would be provided to measure what's a good job. The one is hours, which is just not available anywhere else, not at the FDB, not at the Social Security Administration, which allow you to measure whether somebody is actually getting a higher paying job, as opposed to getting a job where they just work more hours. So that's fundamental in understanding the returns to all of the education programming in the state. And then at the same time, having information on occupation would allow a pretty deep understanding of how to better target certain programs, because it is an imperfect measure, but it's a measure of skills in a way, right? So it is associated with certain skills, and getting that for the entire population would be incredibly important to help understand programming decisions and the impact of these training programs. It's sort of where do they go, but in the sense that do they actually go to the occupation that they're being trained for?
Any other input on employment related metrics or data sources? What about the corrections category? Could anyone speak to what they wrote in that section? This would have been Department of Justice related items. Till?
Well, I'm just raising my hand since, I already spoke, so I'm going to partly repeat myself, but something should be said in the sense that there's increasing research about the how criminal justice involvement, hinders reemployment. And that translate also to the effectiveness of training programs. And it's also increasingly realized how those leaving the criminal justice system, say if they were in prison, are at extremely high risk of very bad and also very costly outcomes, including homelessness, but not only because they're sort of detached from their social structures. And so being able to see that is such a great point of interventions for so many programs that the state is already running. And so it would be incredibly valuable, very tangibly for how to administer programs, but also how to understand how they work.
Thank you. Renee.
Yeah, like I feel like there's a huge disconnect to see that how much available workforce is available, especially once they leave the system and when they're ready to work. I mean, they do receive a lot of training and job skills and so I feel like it's just like really there's a lot of missing gaps. And if we start working on the data, we'll be able to make programs that would be much more effective and efficient, both sides. Just as in fact, like the justice involved when or just as impacted when they enter the workforce, they really need those skills and training to like prevent them from coming back, but then they also need to know the resources that are available. And so I feel like if we explore this more data sets, we'll be able to create more effective programs.
Thank you. Anyone else have thoughts on justice? Oh, Cesar.
Yeah, and just on that regards, especially in California with probation, as they exit incarceration with check-ins at a period time, it's a great data collecting, and you're able to see trends across the state in regards to what careers people incarcerated are going, and what the differences are regionally based off probation systems as well.
Thank you. Any other areas where you ended up writing? I noticed that there was a large volume of writing under unions and also under K-12 adult schools. Does anyone want to speak to the value of those data sets? And also, I want to apologize that we had a mislabeling at the top. So actually, it said California Department of Education twice, and there was like that people were writing about non-credit appropriately for community colleges in that first page. If you want to, if anyone wants to speak to that as well.
Yeah, if I could speak on the union side, I added a couple things there. But in regards to some key industries in California that have a high union density, it's a great opportunity to not just highlight the employer side, which some industries have they have a larger voice there, but this is an opportunity to get worker voice to the table in a very organized way based on industries that have high union density, enough of a sampling to really see the trend across the state and really across the nation.
Any other observations that people want to share?
I wanted to make the case for low-hanging fruit. I guess because in prioritization, I prioritize some things that are, as Till mentioned, high-hanging fruit, but don't want to lose a thread on some things that are still valuable, maybe not as valuable as FTB records to most people, but are lower hanging fruit that could still be an easier to obtain and still valuable. So um, I think I voted for the Department of Consumer Affairs licensure data because we've been after that for a long time, and that may be more low-hanging fruit, but maybe not high priority for a lot of people. So just trying to balance like not only what is most valuable, but like still valuable, but easier to obtain, potentially as an area of focus.
Thank you. All right. Well, this is really helpful. And again, to clarify how we're going to use this information, we'll be synthesizing it into a write-up that you'll be reviewing in your next meeting about things that you want to share with the board that could help to guide them in directing the office about where to direct their attention, given that they are a small and mighty team of 26, and that but still, this is all very important. The thing to remember is that the data system is going to be around for a long time, and sometimes having a multi-year roadmap is really useful. So what's interesting is that way out in the time horizon was ideas about how to understand how to gather better data from Health and Human Services, and there's a number of things that you've mentioned in here that would be relevant for that thinking down the road. Okay, so I'm now going to turn our attention to the next topic for discussion, which is labor market information. So one of the things that's really tricky when we're talking about employment data is that maybe those of us that are researchers understand that traditionally that has meant looking at a data file that's provided by people that report to the state about who they've hired and how much they pay them in each fiscal quarter. But when you talk to the layperson about labor, like workforce data, what they want to know is, what's going to happen with AI? How many jobs are going to go away? What's going to change and what skills do we need? And that falls under the purview of labor market information. So I'm going to, again, share my screen and I'm going to do just a quick primer so we can all be on the same page about what I mean when I use that term. And then we're going to gather information from the task force about priorities in that area. All right, so can you all see my screen okay? Great. Okay. So what is labor market information? So labor market information is actually, rather than a single data point, it's a set of relationships. So it's looking at how do education, workforce training, and jobs actually fit together. So there's a number of things that are commonly used when we're trying to understand labor market information. So generally, we're looking at the number of people that are graduating from particular educational programs. So for example, how many people got a credential in medical assisting or accounting or elementary education. That's sort of like one side of the supply and demand thing. And then you can also be looking at the number of participants that are in workforce training programs. So going back to Cesar's point, apprenticeship is a really valuable way for people to gain the skills necessary to get into in-demand jobs or other training programs that are offered through WIOA. And then you can get to like the level of educational attainment. So did you get a certificate, or did you get an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree or a graduate degree? And that's also important for understanding what employers are looking for when they're doing their hiring. So those are the things that we know about education and training. So that's sort of on the supply side. On the demand side, you're looking at things that relate to jobs. So the first thing is the number of job openings, like how many more medical assistants do we need to hire? You might be looking there at the expected level of educational attainment. And this gets into licensure a little bit, like a licensed vocational nurse. You actually need to have that state seal of approval before you're going to be eligible for that job. Normally, we learn when people get those jobs, how much they are expected to be paid, and what skills are required for them to do that job. And then there's additional information that often informs labor market analyses. So that might be things like, well, who are the people in the community when you're trying to understand who might be available to fill demand for a particular job? Are those people participating in public services, and how is that affecting the way they're engaging with this? There might be things like relevant policies and partnerships that are actually building those pathways. So this gets back to that idea that you need to understand context, that no person is an island that's just getting through things, but maybe one of the reasons something's moving better than in other places is because there's an intentional approach to it. And then you can do things like look empirically at the relationship between what people study and what they actually do. So this is really important when you're looking at fields like psychology. So we know from looking at the census data that when people get a bachelor's degree in psychology, they're equally likely to be a manager as they are to be a counselor, which may not be how we talk to psychology majors about what it is they're going to do. So these are all these complex things that you have to sort of package together that then enables you to give better recommendations to whether it's employers or it's people that are actually designing these programs, whether that's in education or workforce or bridging it, as is happening increasingly in apprenticeship. And that's the kind of thing that we need to have better information on in the state that I think is even bubbling up in the conversations that this group has had. And it certainly was a big focus in the recommendations from the labor agency, saying that we have to get a more consistent and robust way of looking at this. So when LWDA requested this additional functionality, what they said is that it would be really valuable to have some sort of statewide function that's giving the same information to all the agencies and education programs. So there has been so many studies about the healthcare field that have been done independently by the Health and Human Services Agency, by the Labor Agency, by Jobs First, by the community colleges. And rather than doing this over and over again and having things that are constructed using slightly different data sources that cause confusion, just give one set of data that everybody can look at together so that we can do some joint planning. The other problem that they highlighted is that we don't have the same definitions. So what is the Los Angeles region? Different people say different things. What is a creative industry? Different people might put different jobs into different categories, and that makes it very difficult to make comparisons and create sort of a common understanding of how we can better train people for the jobs that are available. So what LWDA sort of put forward is that if we had this function, the state could collect information, more useful information to understand demand, especially related to skills. They could evaluate job quality. So it's not just do you have a job, but is it a good job? Is it one that enables a person to thrive? You could document more effectively career pathways. So there's lots and lots of people that have made maps that say, oh, you start out as a home health aide and you end up as a doctor. And we all know that that very, very rarely happens decisions for a variety of reasons. You could also do analysis about which programs are best at getting people ready for jobs. So especially as the job market changes with AI, it could turn out that those literature majors actually are going to be the most qualified to do AI work because they are experts in thematic analysis. So those are the kinds of things that we would love to know more about. Add to this, so this is new since the labor agency put their recommendations forward, is we've gotten some proposals coming out of the governor's office to create a new entity called the California Education Interagency Council. And so I've got a link in here to where you can find information on that trailer bill. We'll also include it in the notes if you're curious. And so what's interesting about the conceptualization of this council is it's actually given the responsibility to proactively figure out what is changing in the nature of work and helping get information out to a variety of education and training providers. Importantly, this council is not just like a post-secondary council. It recognizes that K-12 adult schools are just as important to coming up with the workforce of tomorrow as UC Berkeley is. And then it actually gives some very specific things that this entity is supposed to do. So it has to look at a variety of data sources and then actually give out reports for both the legislature and the governor to explain what is the projected demand and how prepared we are to have people ready to do those things related to in-demand skills. And they have to do this every 2 years at a minimum. And then there's all these things that are supposed to go into it, like they have to really include economic forecasting. And they also specify in this trailer bill language that an MOU needs to be signed and a legal agreement needs to be signed with C2C to access what are referred to as data and reports. So this is very intriguing because if we go back to that example I gave of psychology majors, there is the possibility, especially if there was that enriched data about employment that you all were asking for, that you could actually get greater clarity about what are the preparation mechanisms that get people ready for work. And importantly, census only gives information on bachelor's degrees that could be used to create that factoid that I gave for you. It does not have information on community college credentials, whether that's a certificate or an associate's degree, nor things like workforce training programs. So this is a very interesting opportunity, and this is where we really need your expertise, because the question is, you've already heard that C2C has an enormous lift that it needs to do just to do the things that are in the pipeline. How could we best use that really interesting data set to be able to help this new entity answer the questions that the legislature and probably your kids want to know about what's possible for work? So what we're going to do is we're going to do another Google Doc where you're going to go in and you're going to answer the following questions. So one of the things that we actually want to do is gather intelligence from you all about when labor market information works well, because that would be very useful for the governing board to understand related to how they might prioritize what information goes from C2C to this new council. So both when does it go well? We want to know from you what the pain points are for what happens when you don't have things that align. We'd also love to get your thoughts about, again, we're trying to think about that fine line between impactful and doable. What do you think would be best to make LMI be better collected and reported? Are there some particular actions that could be taken? And what specifically would you want C2C to be providing to this new entity to be able to do this work? I'm going to quickly check my chat to make sure. Yes, we've got the new document in. So what I'm going to do, once again, I'm going to ask all the task force members to go to that document, and I am going to switch my screen so that members of the public can see what's being written. And what I want to do, let's see, we are at 2:17 right now. I want to give you probably about 6 or 7 minutes to start typing this in. And again, you'll have the opportunity to type further after this meeting. Any questions? Great. Happy typing.
Kathy, actually, I have a clarification question because there's so much amazing data in C2C already, and I don't have sort of it all present in my head. Do you have information on the type of courses kids take in high school?
There's information on the CTE pathways that students were in high school. There are slated data points on things like the highest math course that they took. Judy, what am I forgetting?
Thank you. That's already very helpful.
Okay.
We could drop the link for the data elements by provider in the chat as well.
But important to note, there's not currently course level information for any post-secondary institution. It's just K-12 where there's the course level data. You have program level data for the 4 years in the community colleges. Got about 2 minutes left for writing. Okay, it seems like there's never quite enough time to gather all of your insights. So what we're going to do is we're going to leave this document open through the end of the week, and then we'll consolidate it into notes beginning of next week. So you've got a little bit more time to put in your thoughts, and if there's anyone you want to consult on your team to maybe especially flesh out some of those great ideas for ways to improve labor market data down the road, please feel free to do so. All right, so our final meeting will be next month on April 10th. We did it pretty close to now because what we want to do is use that opportunity to put in front of you sort of a draft report that is the summary of the things that you've said across the meetings. And then what we'll also need to do, and so if you could reach out to me privately, but if you want to be at the May board meeting for the governing board to be able to share the ideas from this group. That way you'd be there along with Javier Romero, who is our governing board liaison, to be able to just make sure that you can answer questions that the governing board might have about these discussions. So again, reach out to me if you're interested in doing that. And then we'll make sure that we get that draft report out to you about a week in advance. So you've got some time to really go through it so that we can spend the majority of the meeting really making sure that we've addressed everything to your satisfaction and having you just step back for a moment and think about what are the most important things you'd want the governing board to know as they're getting ready to prioritize the work plan for the office. So I want to turn this back to Marianne or Judy to see if there's any final comments that you'd like to make to the task force.
Giving Judy a minute, but just a big thank you. Especially want to thank, Abby and all of the work that she has led from the Labor and Workforce Development side. And we have multiple governing board members and advisory board members who are serving here on this task force, which has been really helpful. And then just a special, thanks to all of you for doing the hard work of helping us prioritize. I think today was one of the sessions I was most excited about. And also I think it's a hard task. So thank you for that.
All right. Have a wonderful rest of your day.